From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm especially happy to welcome Ambassador Mauro Vieira of Brazil, Andre Dunham from the Cultural Section, Minister Marco Vilaça, members of Congress, diplomats, and scholars from near and far. The Brazilian Embassy and the Library of Congress are sponsoring this event, and as the mighty Yeda Vieira, our super specialist in Brazil, has already indicated, this is an object of great affection as well as intellectual interest for me personally. The Brazilian Congressman Barney Frank and his staff have been most helpful with the arrangements, and I want to thank them. This is, after all, the Library of Congress, and Congress has been the great patron of this and the builder and the restorer of this beautiful building, to which we welcome you. Now, we've had a very active relationship with Brazil, with the National Library of the country, with Brazilian foundations, and with the Embassy of Brazil. Since 1966, the library has maintained an office in Rio de Janeiro. This has made possible for us to receive about 500 books every month, in addition to regular mailings of chapbooks, the Literatura de Cordel, of which we have more than 8,000, which is possibly the largest such collection anywhere. We have nearly 100 recordings of major Brazilian poets and novelists in Portuguese, and we routinely host events focused on Brazil. Thus, with the collaboration of the Brazilian Embassy, we are hosting this symposium on Joaquim Nabuco, the first full-time ambassador of Brazil to the United States and a major abolitionist. He died, in fact, in Washington, D.C. in 1910 after a long and distinguished career as a lawyer, diplomat, as a lifelong foe of slavery, as a writer, including about literature, Camões. It was his doctoral thesis and a book later. A lecture on Pan-American ideals and the Brazilian-United States relationship. In 1909, as a matter of fact, he gave a speech the year before his death here in Washington for the D.C. Commission on the centenary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. Now, this is especially meaningful to us because the Library of Congress is, of course, the holder of the Lincoln Papers, which are all online, and we were the location for the commission for the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth last year, and have mounted the most inclusive exhibit on Lincoln ever seen anywhere, which has been touring the United States all this year. So we're honoring a man who was truly a friend and a person of great repute in both his own country and in the United States. Now, the library has nearly 100 books by and about Nabuco, perhaps the largest collection anywhere. You can see a list of most of them here, and there is in the Hispanic Luso collection reading room upstairs, where you'll have an opportunity to see some of these materials. Now, when I visited Brazil in 1998, I was hosted by then President Fernando Henrique Cardoso and his wife Ruth in Brasilia. Later, they came to the library as Kluge scholars to continue both of them, their individual researches, and since then published books based on their work here. Indeed, we have nearly 500,000 books on Brazil, one of the strongest collections in this institution, housed in several divisions. Music, for example, has the works of Heitor Villa-Lobos, and in 1941, Brazil's premier painter, Candido Portinari, prepared the murals that now grace the entrance to the Hispanic division, and that which is, of course, Brazilian as well as Hispanic, Portuguese. That reading room, the Latin American reading room, is the first international reading room among the 21 open public reading rooms here in the 3 buildings on Capitol Hill that comprise the Library of Congress. Now, President Jefferson, for whom this building is named and whose library has been restored and is on exhibit upstairs, was extremely interested in Brazil. In a letter to Madame de Stael that is housed in the manuscript division, he wrote, "Brazil is the nucleus." And if you look on the first map of the New World, which is also on exhibit upstairs in a very rich collection given by Jay Kislak and combined with other materials we have, you will see that the first use of the word America ever in any document is on the 1507 Waldseemüller map. That is the first that shows the world is round, that there was a distinct Pacific Ocean, and the word America is written right in the middle of what is now Brazil. And the northern half of the Western hemisphere is identified as terra incognita. So you are the primary claimants to the title of American. In any event, 1820, Jefferson wrote, and I'm quoting him now, "I would rejoice to see the fleets of Brazil and the United States riding together as brethren of the same family and pursuing the same object." In 1966, the library, since that time, since 1966, the library has had as its only Latin American overseas office the one in Brazil. A more recent initiative has been the participation right from the beginning, from the prototype now into the actual thing itself online, the participation of the National Library of Brazil in the World Digital Library, which is now a UNESCO project. This is something that we initiated, and as I say, had from the beginning the National Library of Brazil as a founding partner. As a result, we received hundreds of documents and pictures in digitized form excuse me, from the Empress Teresa Cristina collection, along with hundreds of maps. In turn, the Library of Congress has sent to the Brazilian National Library digitized items that the Brazilian counterpart does not have. The president of the National Library of Brazil, Muniz Sodré, was chosen as one of the 5 directors of the World Digital Library, which will meet in December at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. I might add that in terms of the use of the library's Brazilian collection, the most recent Nobel laureate, Mario Vargas Llosa, when he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which I used to direct and where I set up a Latin American program that had a strong emphasis on Brazil, worked here in the Library of Congress for his book on the Conselheiro tradition in Brazil. So it's interesting that you had a Peruvian, a great Peruvian writer working on Brazil here in Washington at the library. So we're always more than glad to receive researchers from Brazil and from the rest of the world to peruse works on Brazil, many of them not available anywhere else. So it is a great pleasure and honor for us to welcome all of you to this symposium, our brethren in the continent-wide country of Brazil, which is in so many ways has so many interesting parallels and even interaction with our own history, none more so than in the figure we honor today at this symposium. So it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this symposium on Joaquim Nabuco, abolitionist, diplomat, author, a kind of universal figure where knowledge, policy, and imagination flow together as they do in your wonderful country. So it's, again, my pleasure to welcome you and to turn things over now, I guess, to the ambassador, who is our collaborator on this, and with thanks to Georgette Dorn and, of course, Ieda Wiarda, our Brazilian sage and link with this wonderful country. I have to mention one more person from Brazil, Mr. Minlin, who had a great private library, which I guess goes now to Sao Paulo. And I remember visiting him and so many other fascinating people in my visits there. I was saying to several people from the embassy, I think if I discovered Brazil earlier in life, this is a common failing of North Americans. But once you discover it, you sort of wish, certainly if you're a scholar, that I'd spent more time, had more ability to study the history, the culture, the geography, and the imaginative literature and life of a country whose music and sports I've long admired, but whose whole development seems to me such a fascinating counterpart and parallel to our own, your development in South America, like ours in North America, has so many interesting parallels that we hope that this seminar and this commemoration can be also a little further spur to better understanding between our nations. So thank you all very, very much for being here.
I have been asked to remind you that if you need translations, you can use this and channel 1, canal 1, se vocês precisam. E agora, uma outra pessoa que não precisa ter uma introdução, Sua Excelência, o embaixador, e também eu preciso mostrar que aqui no The Washington Diplomat, ele apareceu. Muitíssimo obrigado, é uma grande honra.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ieda Viarda. Well, Dr. James Billington, Librarian of Congress, dear Minister Marcos Vilaça, President of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, and Mrs. Vilaça, distinguished speakers and guests of the seminar. I also would like to mention Professor Ivo Pitangui, very well-known Brazilian plastic surgeon, and Ambassador Geraldo Holanda Cavalcante, both members of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. And also, I'd like to address Congressman Mauricio Hans, representative of the state of Pernambuco in the National House of Representatives. Please allow me a few words in Portuguese just to begin. Eu queria agradecer ao Dr. Billington pelo apoio e pelo entusiasmo que sempre teve desde o primeiro dia em que vim visitá-lo. Teve grande entusiasmo por esse programa de celebração do centenário de morte de Joaquim Nabuco. Ele, que é um grande entusiasta do Brasil, é um grande apoiador da seção hispânica e grande conhecedor também do Brasil, onde já esteve várias vezes. Colaborar com a Biblioteca do Congresso foi importantíssimo para a organização deste seminário, que a Embaixada fez com um apoio total e absoluto da Academia Brasileira de Letras. Sem o apoio da Academia, do seu presidente, o ministro Vilaça, seria impossível acrescentarmos algo a este importante ano de comemorações que a Academia vem celebrando no Brasil e que teve um capítulo anterior, recentemente, que teve lugar em Roma, onde também Joaquim Nabuco foi embaixador do Brasil. Em seguida, vamos ouvir distintos professores, os membros da academia e distintos professores americanos que vão nos ensinar e nos contar bastante sobre Joaquim Nabuco. Now I come back to English, and I would like to say that it's a great honor for me to open the seminar, Joaquim Nabuco, His Time and His Legacy, organized by the Brazilian Embassy in collaboration with the Library of Congress and the Brazilian Academy of Letters. Joaquim Aurélio Barreto Nabuco de Araújo was born in Recife, state of Pernambuco, on August 19, 1849. He was a distinguished Brazilian writer, a statesman, a leading voice for the abolitionist movement in Brazil. The year of 2010 has been declared the Joaquim Nabuco year in Brazil. Many events are being organized to commemorate the centennial of his death, which occurred on January 17, 1910 in Washington, D.C., where he was serving as the first Brazilian ambassador to the United States. Joaquim Nabuco was one of the founders of the Brazilian Academy of Letters back in 1897, and its first Secretary General. In fact, many of the most talented individuals who worked with him after his return to public life in 1899, 10 years after the proclamation of Republic in Brazil, came from the Academy. Nabuco was not only a man of ideas, but also a man of action. As such, he played a key role in the abolitionist movement and the fight against slavery in Brazil. On the one hand, he wrote The Abolitionist, one of the most important books against slavery and one of his masterworks. On the other hand, as a congressman, he led the fight against the supporters of slavery in Brazil. Nabuco can be also considered to be one of the founding fathers of modern Brazil diplomacy, in addition to Baron of Rio-Branco and Rui Barbosa, who were both his contemporaries in the early 20th century in Brazil. At the beginning of 1905, Joaquim Nabuco was appointed the first ambassador of Brazil to the United States, after the Brazilian legation in Washington was elevated to the status of embassy. He presented his credentials to President Theodore Roosevelt on May 24, 1905. Because of his sophisticated education, his intelligence, and his fluency in English, he soon became a distinguished member of the Washingtonian Society. It was his second tour of duty as a diplomat in the United States, where he had served as a secretary at the Brazilian legation from 1876 to 1877. At that time, the status of embassy was usually a privilege of great powers. It was a symbol of a superior position ascribed to certain countries, and it also meant that the ambassador had direct access to the US president, something that was not possible for a legation minister. The opening of the Brazilian embassy in Washington was a landmark of what historians call the reorientation of the axis of the Brazilian foreign relations from Europe to the Americas during the tenure of Rio-Branco as Minister of Foreign Relations, which lasted 10 years from 1902 to 1912. In 1905, the United States reciprocated by opening its embassy in Rio de Janeiro and the first American embassy in South America. At the helm of the Brazilian embassy in Washington, Joaquim Nabuco worked with Rio-Branco to strengthen Brazilian relations with the United States. Those two great Brazilian statesmen realized that the US would become a major power in world affairs and tried to adapt Brazilian foreign policies to the circumstances of the new emerging world. The unwritten alliance between Brazil and the United States, a term coined by Bradford Burns, was based on the relative importance of both Brazil and the United States in the Americas. It was also conceived to counterbalance the Eurocentrism of international relations of that time and enhance the status of the Americas in the world. In Washington, Nabuco enjoyed great prestige among the diplomatic and academic communities. President Theodore Roosevelt often received him for long conversations in the White House and admired him for his knowledge of the history of the Americas. Secretary of State Root was also a friend and a frequent interlocutor of Nabuco. As the Brazilian ambassador in Washington, Nabuco worked to garner support for Rio de Janeiro to become the venue for the Third Pan-American Conference in 1906. He achieved his goals and also promoted a visit of Secretary of State Root to Rio de Janeiro. Nabuco was co-president of the conference at the Monroe Palace in Rio de Janeiro and undertook his best effort to achieve a final agreement that created the Bureau of American Republics in Washington, which could be deemed as a precursor of the Organization of American States. Although Nabuco had an European background, he soon began to appreciate the American society for its democracy, mobility, and openness to immigration. He was a frequent traveler in the United States and crossed the country from coast to coast by train. He understood the American people and he realized the role it would play in the world affairs. Nabuco gave many conferences at American universities, including the University of Chicago, Wisconsin, Yale, and Columbia. In his conferences, he expressed his admiration for the New World and the contributions he believed it would make to the world. Joaquim Nabuco died on January 17, 1910, in Washington, when he was only 60 years old. President William Taft, Secretary of State Philander Knox, Supreme Court Justice, U.S. Senators and Congressmen attended his funeral. President Taft ordered the American cruiser North Carolina to take Nabuco's body back to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro. Shortly after Nabuco's death, the Pan American Union building in Washington, D.C. was finally completed. At the dedication ceremony, the Secretary of State said the following words about him: "One voice that should have spoken here today is silent, but many of us cannot forget or cease to mourn and to honor our dear and noble friend Joaquim Nabuco, ambassador from Brazil, Dean of the American Diplomatic Corps, respected, admired, trusted, loved, and followed by all of us. He was a commanding figure in the international movement of which the creation of this building is part. To celebrate the legacy of Joaquim Nabuco is to celebrate his ideas, which are still alive in the thoughts and actions of those who seek justice, social inclusion, peace, and integration among all peoples. As an opportunity to discuss his life, his ideas, and his legacy, the Brazilian Embassy, the Library of Congress, and the Brazilian Academy of Letters are honored to present and to sponsor the seminar Joaquim Nabuco, His Life and His Time. I thank you very much for being here today, and now we'll listen to very distinguished speaker. Thank you very much.
As always, here at the library, we always learn a great deal. We always learn a great deal here at the library. I'd already learned a lot about Nabuco, but much that His Excellency said, I didn't know. I needed a copy, and if you need a copy, I have them at my office. Thank you very much, and now I'm going to invite Minister Villaça to come to the stage. He's going to be the moderator, and he's also someone who needs no introduction, but we want to thank him as the president of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. Without the help of the Brazilian Academy, I don't think this program would have been possible. He's also someone who's very important for us here. And here is my boss. There's some equipment here that you can retrieve, channel 1, in case you need interpreting. So, Your Excellency, Minister, it's a great honor.
Of course he's going to speak in Portuguese. What are you talking about?
Dear friends, Brazilian friends, and American friends, don't take into account this temporary, this was the fruits of
I thought that modern art disregarded a physical stepping, but I took a step, false step, fell down. I wish at first to thank and congratulate Dr. Billington, who truly is the most responsible person.
The receiving the Academy had to, in order to promote this meeting today. In the person of Mauro Vieira, you have the soul, the determination, the willingness, the dynamism that occurs again. His diplomatic experience is one of constant support and encouragement for Brazilian culture. Mauro is one who's fully dedicated to Brazilian political culture and Brazilian relations with the rest of the world. He's young, despite his hair. He's very young, but he's already a professional diplomat with a great deal of experience in the way of services rendered to the interrelationship of individuals. Thank you, Mauro Vieira, for the assistance given to this commemoration for Nabuco. And also, I'd like to greet Ms. Bethel, who's a veteran of Brazilian studies in general, and especially of Joaquim Nabuco. And I can say the same about Professor Jackson, given his important work on the question of Joaquim Nabuco. With me here are Professor Pitangui, who is the pride of Brazil. He's definitely the pride of Brazil. Very few doctors throughout the world enjoy his prestige. Prestige that's built on technical ability and human endeavors. I don't know whether Ivo Pitangui serves more on the basis of his value for medicine or for humanity. And here is an example of Brazilian diplomacy. Another true example, Geraldo Holanda Cavalcanti, who is at once a poet, a historian, a biographer, and with this he unites the contribution, and I should confess this, he's from the state of Pernambuco, I must admit, and for us, Pernambuco is sort of the cradle of the world. Everything begins there. And next, the federal representative, Mauricio Hans, whom I admire greatly. And I'll admit again that this is a very sincere admiration, because Mauricio Hans is a political adversary to my family in Pernambuco, and to admire an adversary, a political adversary, he has to be really good. And Mauricio is definitely a very good congressman and a very good politician. He's an honored man. He's a scholar and dedicated to the role he plays. I hope that I haven't forgotten anybody. Those who I mentioned today, so that I can organize my thoughts a little better. Nabuco represents an avalanche in our minds. He brings to the fore so many subjects, so many topics that perforce studying him is very complex. It's very complicated. I'm going to try to organize his thoughts a bit, or the thoughts that I have concerning Nabuco. If I go too long, I'm sorry. Those who are present at this sort of meeting have to prepare themselves for this, and the Brazilian diplomats know this. Those who come to this kind of meeting have to be disposed to listen to long talks. But I'm not going to lose this opportunity and miss this opportunity to return here to the Library of Congress and have the joy of giving a presentation. My first great satisfaction under this roof was a few years ago when I came and we went to the Brazilian section. I don't know whether it's in this building. And in a very timid way, very humbly, I tried to find a book whose author was Marcos Vilaça. The name didn't mean anything to the person who was helping me, but he opened the catalog and found some of my books. It was a glorious opportunity for me. I was so happy, and because I was here at the Library of Congress, I would visit other libraries throughout the world. And at the time, my books hadn't been translated in other languages, and I'm not gonna miss saying this. Books in Spanish, English, German, and this was the greatest privilege of being in the library. The other ones today, the other opportunity that brings me joy is being here today, and these fortunate, felicitous occasions in honor of Nabuco will never be just festive or just presenting an anatomy of these instances. Without memory, we lose the substance of things, the memory to measure time and the relevance of time. Without memory, the present eludes us, and at the same time, we speak of a dead past. Without the past, we lose our dreams. And man loses his notion of places and people. He who loses memory loses will. He remains inert, and he doesn't know where he stands. And Anos told us that when God created writers, he knew the works that he would produce, and without omissions. Joaquim Nabuco wasn't put to the test. He didn't neglect. He wasn't omissive. And here we are to reaffirm the greatness of his works, and which were shown through books, in tribunals, in speeches abroad, around tables of international negotiations, through columns in newspapers, in his letters, and through the voice of the people, and in the Treaty of Quincas. When in Rio de Janeiro, there occurred, as we were reminded just recently by Ambassador Mauro Vieira, the third Pan American Conference, the foreign diplomats were awestruck at the popularity of Nabuco. Gilberto Freire wrote that from then on, Nabuco was seen as the great Brazilian of his time and of all time. Alceu Amoroso Lima, the eminent man of letters in Brazil, would follow up with the following. Nabuco was the very image, the most expressive image of Brazilian and the most important figure of our cultural history. In the celebrations of this year, this vision of Nabuco as an example, a model, is reaffirmed through the canon, the cultural canon of Brazil. Brazil, Joaquim Nabuco as a social transformer. He brought the people to the fore in the struggle for liberty. And this is what a congressman reminds us. He wasn't satisfied to be merely an abolitionist. He wanted a true transformation to occur. And he said that ending slavery isn't enough. We have to destroy the stuff of slavery and implement democracy in our land. And the book, Minha Formação, My Experience, is his greatest self-portrait. It was his greatest moment. And as a establishment of the world citizen, he always said, I'm the son of Pernambuco. the Brazilian Academy of Letters shows the contrast between two inseparable men, Machado de Assis, an aristocrat of letters, and Nabuco, who belonged to the imperial hierarchy, who humbled himself to better hear the cry for freedom. And we here celebrate the centenary of the death of Nabuco with curiosity and empathy, as we did for the old Machado. And we're realizing conferences in Bologna, in Rome, in London, Buenos Aires, the republication of some of his works, and we have gone throughout the world recognizing his work. And we went to Recife and Masangana, where we heard the chiming of the bells, and this is all going to be done in a certain way, as Agostinho Gimpona said, with respect to the various aspects of the present of the past, which is memory, the present of the present, which is perception, and the present that has a view to the future, which is hope. The Dutch colony in Brazil, in Pernambuco, helped to instill the racial problem, since whites, blacks, and Indians and native Brazilians composed the new multi-ethnic society. The Negro was the captive race, and the slave labor sustained the economy and governments. To challenge the empire through abolitionism was actually a struggle against slavery. José Bonifácio, in the constitutional letter, proposed his representation or his position against slavery. He demonstrated that free labor was more beneficial than slavery. And in Brazil, unless it transformed slavery into full citizenship, it wouldn't forge ahead. And if he hadn't done what he did, history would be different, and Nabuco's work would be more easy. We're independent, but human servitude continues. And the Valongo market in Rio de Janeiro, you would see that the black man who could have been liberated continued a slave. No one thought of, during this era, during this period, of liberating the slaves. The surprise would come in the person of Nabuco, the aristocrat whose destiny was to be part of the empire. And Masangana was the farm, the plantation where he was raised by his godmother. And Nabuco, from then on, would always have a longing for the slave, but horrified by slavery. And saudade, or longing, is that of the black saints. He began as almost an apostolic figure against for the abolitionism. This was dedication to the struggle for change and transformation. As through abolitionism, which is one of his classic works, Nabuco notices that in other societies, the struggle against slavery was a very basic struggle, and with us it was different. The Brazilian Academy, we explain why we're here, why we're so enthusiastic, why we're so enthused about these commemorations, and this is a sign of the times, really. More than a centenary of, or more than a celebration of 500 years Brazil. It's a messenger of the past that's building tomorrow. The Academy is dedicated to remembering the person of Nabuco and to follow and to study his aesthetic sensibility, his public role. This doesn't stop us from learning about the whole man, and as his biography shows, the understanding of the present day and also of the future of our situation in the Brazilian utopia. When one reads Nabuco, one understands how he looked forward to this. Rubem Dario recognizes that at once Nabuco's thinking and the depths which he reached, usually through beautiful imagery, demonstrates his constant studying of the poets. Today, we're here studying the bipolarity of reason and sentiment that are dominant in the person of Nabuco. The sentiment of his impression of England, which is so aristocratic, and the French dimension, the artistic Italian dimension, and the material civilization, so impressive in the form of the United States. Monarchists who converted to the Republican ideal. This is studying this monarchist who converted to a Republican idea gives me great pleasure. And to be a citizen of both the Americas and Europe. We Brazilians, says Nabuco, the same can be said of the American people. We belong to America, to the Americas, to this new land, elevating our spirits, in Europe for its stratified layers. Nabuco continues, now turning his back on the dual absence. We're condemned to the most terrible instability. In America, we don't have the landscape, architecture, landscape, everything around us, the historic background, human perspective. In Europe, we lack citizenship, that is, the means by which we came to being. All of the landscapes, Mauro reminded us a little while ago, and this is always a polemical question when you analyze Nabuco, to understand exactly what he meant by this and in which context it was said. The New World landscapes, all the landscapes, the Amazon, the Pampas, the Argentine Pampas, aren't worth to me a piece of Salerno and Amalfi. In the midst of luxury of politics, we're as if we were amongst the tropical forests. I know very well that in not leaving Rio de Janeiro, there's nothing more enchanting to the eyes than the parks of São Clemente, the ways of the aqueducts, and on the way to Tijuca, the Sugarloaf as seen from Flamengo during the sunset. All of this is saying that a little piece of the planet of which humanity did not take control, it's like a terrestrial paradise before the first human tears. I don't mean that there are two humanities, a high humanity and we belong to and the lower humanity, and we belong to the second one. Maybe humanity will renew itself again through the fruits, American fruits, but human spirit, which is only one and centralized, is on the other side of the ocean in the New World that will nourish everything, all aesthetic imagination. And this is the ultimate solace, this spirit which feels itself so aloof from. And Nabuco concludes, the stability that I refer to myself to, to which I refer, has been modified. The duality has disappeared. When between the sentiment, which is my nation, I can see that imagination can penetrate the tropical landscape and the spirit. I left Europe saving in me what's universal, which is religion and letters. And this is the reason that stimulated us through our embassies with the knowledge of universities. And here I refer to especially Yale University, Columbia, Wisconsin. With the aid of Nabuco's lessons, everybody who comes here to consecrate the memory of Nabuco on the 21st of October of 1906, Joaquim Nabuco, very tired, exhausted, and felicitous for having participated in the Pan American Conference, returning to the United States, or from the United States to Recife, or leaving Recife, which he saw for the last time. And then he wrote, far from Cape San Agustin, the familiar landscape of the Pernambucan coast, the coconut palms, the white beaches, the green pastures, the sunset before Recife, I leave. And the friends in the academy, he referred to the academy, to the law academy, and there are no young people in the Brazilian Academy of Letters. They're all walking around with K's. And at nightfall, the moon forms a caravan of gold above the black clouds, and that's how I said goodbye to Recife, perhaps for forever. The nightfall is very short, but mine would be long. And through my intellectual and political activities, which he involved himself in more, in 1907, in the summer, he admits that he's fatigued. He says, I'm not made to be an old man. And when I read these words, they really marked me, and now that I'm old, I know that I wasn't made for the same. And Machado de Assis, his great friend, writes, his great friend with whom he never had differences, despite the episodes mentioned by Marquês de Olinda. The Brazilian diplomat doesn't like references to the Baron. He said thus, this is Machado. It's a great privation to live far from one's friends in a strange land as a foreigner. Above all, to end up this way. But I hope still to return before nightfall. The mirage. Without the service, time of service from which to retire, without resources to live with a big family, Nabuco had to follow through with his endless journey in order to complete or to fulfill his diplomatic mission. Besides his deafness, and Dr. Pitangui is going to talk about this. Nabuco's health problems, and myself as a hypochondriac, I'm very anxious to hear about this. Besides that deafness, the sleeplessness, none of this would leave him. He would say, I got to this age 60, breathless and exhausted from life. And then he comes up with this beautiful phrase, now, this sentence, now during my decline I have to use other muscles, not those of vigor, but those of resistance. Death overcame Nabuco here in January of 1910. Somewhat earlier, he distanced himself from the torpor that dominated him. Doctor, I think I'm losing my mind. Everything but this, anything but this. His mortal remains were sent to Rio de Janeiro and then to Recife. My land has a characteristic. Sometimes it's very unjust towards the living, but it's grandiose when it comes to the memory of the dead. And his mortal remains are there by his own will and the will of the people of Pernambuco. 1 year earlier, in January of 1909, Nabuco wrote in his diary, the body can disintegrate, can decay, but never the spirit. The spirit of Nabuco never decayed. Thank you very much.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt you, man, because you were doing a... Thank you very much. Lady speaking distant from the... I accept the mission of being the moderator. I'm not really a good moderator. I'm more of a provocateur. And so now I call forth our following speakers, Ambassador Cavalcanti, Dr. Pitangui, Dr. Jekyll and Jackson, and Deputy Mauricio Hunts, who, as I've mentioned, is a rival of our family, so I left him for last. I want to stand here next to Dr. Pitangui because as a doctor, it's good to have a doctor at my age standing right by me. It's my pleasure here to now, with everyone seated, to offer the floor to Professor Ivo Pitangui, or Dr. Ivo Pitangui.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Dr. Billington, all the others that made it possible. My president, my dear friend, Marco Villaça, our dear ambassador, Mauro, that gave to us such a fantastic and incredible welcome. And we feel very much at home, and especially after hearing all this extraordinary consideration about this extraordinary man. It comes to me to tell you a few words. Mention Joaquim Nabuco, as we all know, has deservedly received the highest praise from many different countries that witnessed the working of his sorry intellect. In commemorating 100 years of his death, the United States Senate and the Library honors a worldly statesman and a politician who will forever be remembered to his fight to end slavery in Brazil. This was a cause that divided your own country, only 5 decades before Joaquim Nabuco's death. And that proved to be one of the greatest challenges of our history. It's fitting, therefore, that 150 years since the declaration of the Civil War, we may gather to celebrate the mind of a great man, great human being, one who valued the freedom of his fellow men and equality among his country's citizens. Joaquim Nabuco was born into an aristocratic family, people with a prominent position in the society of the Brazilian Empire. Due to his father's many travels, he was taken under the wing of Ana Rosa, who would become a second mother to him. His upbringing in the sugar plantation mill of Massangana, that stayed in his memory up to 8 years of age, in the interior of the state of Pernambuco, allowed him to experience the hardships of the slaves and to see the injustice of the system that was so deep-rooted in Brazil. As a young boy, Joaquim made friendship with the black people who worked with his godmother's estate. He spent much of his time playing with the children of slaves, exploring his surroundings, accompanied by boys and girls his age, no different from him, but in the color of their skin. To think that these people were the property of someone sold and bought at the market must surely have impressed deeply the young Joaquim. His later education presented him to the libertarian ideas of the great thinkers of Europe and the United States. The contrast between a young nation dependent on intensive hand labor to supply the sugar industry and the old world rapidly moving towards industrialization was one of the factors, among others, that influenced the determination to bring equality to Brazilian society. This mixture of culture and sheer intellectual capacity were the foundations that would sustain his writing and his achievement in diplomacy and politics. Tall and elegant, well-dressed and well-versed, Joaquim Nabuco took on the conservative slaveholding social order and created the Brazilian Anti-Slavery Society. He was a man of words and letters, but also a man of action. He fought against the status quo, together with Rebouças, Patrocínio, Castro Alves, and Rui Barbosa, among others. Indefatigable, he wrote innumerable speeches, articles, and lectures. He traveled and served overseas as a journalist and afterwards as a diplomat. However, late in his life, his health began to fail, and the towering figure was brought down over a span of a few years by an unusual systemic disease. When he turned 55 years old, he noted in his diary that he felt gloomy and weak and with persistent migraines. Other symptoms mentioned deafness, tremor, swelling, dizziness, and syncope. In 1907, a diagnosis was made that explained that there were different clinical manifestations. The name would be polycythemia vera. It has been said that this was a cruel irony, an exceptional and extraordinary character succumbed to an equally rare pathology. He was devastated by the news. He sought specialists, something to cure him, but he was afraid that the disease would in the end be the victor. Many of Joaquim Nabuco's disorders are typical of polycythemia vera, a disease that affects around 5 people in 1 million. It's incurable even today. The increase in blood cells produce weakness, headaches, lightheadedness, and visual disturbance. Fatigue and melancholy are typical. The skin becomes hot and red and may itch severely, especially after a hot bath. It's known that he would use a knife blade to cool his forehead, when at work. Lower grade fever and weight loss due to the hypermetabolism add to the general discomfort and explain his gaunt figure. In a series of letters that he wrote to Graça Aranha, that worked with him and he turned to be a great personal friend, he noted in 1906, "My health has not remained so sparkling after so many strong emotions, so much work, and moving around like this much. I hope, nevertheless, to recover myself with a whole month of rest. My arms almost refuse to obey me, and my eyes are sore. My neck pains me, as does my head. Due to the high viscosity of the blood that occurs in polycythemia vera, we can observe that these symptoms are the consequence of the difficulty that the bloodstream has in transporting the oxygen." The following year he wrote, "I know that my health is your main concern. Let me say that the waters of Vitel, where he did go for a kind of a treatment, have greatly helped me. Before, my head was always congested, swimming in a bath of hot blood. You can well imagine that this is not the best situation for a man to think. I now feel my head much cooler, which is much and what I must aspire, my great envy in other people." In another letter to Graça Aranha, he wrote it in 1908, only 2 years before his death, he writes, "I'm saddened on my isolation. My eyes barely allow me to work. My head is always hot. I spend hours doing nothing, just trying to rest." We can imagine his despotism and hopelessness as the disease diminished his physical capacity. He wrote on completing 58 years, "I never imagined one day becoming an old man. I still feel myself young like a fire." Weak and spent by the ailment, yet with his mind working constantly, he tried to keep up with his obligations and the numerous academic invitations that were forwarded to the distinguished diplomat. He continued to fight for another of his ideas, the union of the America and the Pan-Americanism. His health deteriorated until the final consequences of polycythemia vera, arteriosclerosis, and circulatory failure. As we know, the thickness of the blood can cause an ischemic stroke or a cerebral hemorrhage. Either way, his death resulted from a cerebrovascular accident. When his death in this city in 1910, he was mourned and honorable as a noble figure. Thank you very much for letting me share with you some thoughts on this great man, Joaquim Nabuco, a notable Brazilian and a citizen of the world. Thank you very much.
Em seguida, tenho a honra de dar a palavra ao embaixador Geraldo Holanda Cavalcante.
Chairman, members of the dais, friends, when Dr. James Billington referred to the map found at the beginning of the 16th century, if I understood correctly, in this library, he mentioned that Brazil at the time was labeled on the map Terra Incognita. And I was reminded that if that map was as faithful as we're hoping it could have been, that it might, and we might have to examine it more carefully to see if this is in fact the portion of Brazil which is the northeast between two small rivers, Capibaribe and Beberibe, that form a common, that join a common source. Everyone knows this, I'm certain. In either event, speaking of that state of Pernambuco, speaking of Nabuco, we have to talk about his native state of Pernambuco, and this has been mentioned here. If a native of Pernambuco is filled with vanity, I don't think so. I think people from Pernambuco are modest. They simply recognize that Pernambuco have a historical tradition that need be respected. My issue is Nabuco the Republican. Much has been said about Nabuco in many places in this world this year. We've highlighted his leading role in the struggle against slavery and the aristocratic personality. I chose a niche which has not been so discussed: Nabuco and his Republican leanings, referring to his state in France where he stayed between 1873 and 1874. Nabuco said, I don't want to get overly heavy with quote unquote, but let me just say, you'll see, however, when the intelligence of the wording will show you when it's Nabuco's words and not mine. So between 1873 and 74, Nabuco said, in my training in the politics, I found myself split between the most primitive duality that can exist, the sentiment, the will, by reason. I was an exalted supporter of Thiers, as any French Republican. His imagination, his history was thoroughly legitimate. In short, I was a Thierist politician. In France, that meant a Republican, which doesn't mean that I was a Republican by principle. Much of the contrary, in sense. The Third Republic in France was ultimately a transition between, or was a transaction by monarchist politicians on the way to Republican. So Nabuco here reaffirms the monarchical principles. The significant effect on me was to prove experimentally that a type of government is not a theoretical matter, but rather a relative and practical one. And now in relation to Brazil, this is an important support for my personal monarchist preference. These are words 25 years earlier when Nabuco had yet to enter the political realm, but it shows the internal drama that he underwent throughout his life. Nabuco was predisposed to accept certain Republican values that were not consolidated in time because he didn't want to see his monarchical values, his earlier monarchical values, undermined. But the spirit that ultimately has to rip through all previous chains created for and by them. In my case, I would be entirely unable to completely break the shackles of those that once bound me, and monarchical sentiment was one of those. Nabuco visited time and again to Europe, living for a long time in London, privately during the Empire, and in service of the Republican government in 1889, working at the Brazilian mission in London, handling Brazilian defense matters, particularly boundary affairs with British Guyana. His stay in England left lasting marks, and he wrote, perhaps I can sum up my political solidification saying that monarchy is part of the moral atmosphere of England, and that British influence was the strongest and longest lasting ever received by me. This influence, moral and aesthetic, certainly more than political, as he himself said, saying that above all, this was aristocratic artistic, and what allowed me to be a Republican as a youth was probably having been an earlier aristocrat for life, which he referred to as a worldly philosophy. So this question of social government, aristocracy, the question of class, always strongly impressed upon our dear Nabuco. The first mission of Nabuco to the United States in 76 and 77 is registered in his diary as a series of deceptions. Inevitably, everything compares in New York with that which I had lived through strongly and intensely in London. Nabuco, who arrived in the United States already imbued with the urban strengths of London, witness what he wrote in 89 and 90. We cannot say that in this country, we cannot say of this country that it has any ideal. It's just a country par excellence of practical reality. But everything ultimately here is material in its end. He almost despaired in explaining Tilden's electoral campaign, and here a long quote from politics. The general impression that I had and continue to have is a struggle lacking any interest of patriotism, delicacy in manners, or the process that make England, for instance, politics an acceptable career and even welcome to even the more sensitive spirits. Nothing of the kind exists in North America, which would lead me to consider their institutions superior to those of English. The politics were more vicious. The class of men drawn to political circles were lower, not the finer spirits or souls as in England. Much to the contrary. The more intelligent in America were repelled by the life of politics. Now, he could be corrected, and he corrected in his book, My Training Later. He came back on some of these words and said, well, now I have different, perhaps, thoughts. Today, I would no longer say about the United States that it's a nation lacking ideals. I would say it was a country whose ideal is still in formation. Later, in the publication of my book in 1890, Nabuco further reflected and had a more mature vision of the future of nations, as he analyzed in his work Balmaceda the specific case of the country of Chile. In the Republican experiences, I detected two vectors: the spirit of reform, and even utopia, and that of system. The first is of the spirit of races such as Florentine, France, most distinguished cultures. Now in Chile, in the words of Balmaceda himself, is that Chile represents the combination of science and a government of freedom. Between one and the other, Nabuco highlighted the combined spirit of secular institutions, amongst which he mentions, and that's no surprise to anyone, again, the British Constitution. In My Training, Nabuco wrote, the combination of social manichaeism between England, the machinations between North America and England, the combination almost always favors England. And pages later, he would explain why. Because the American government is not the government of the best men, as we traditionally think of in the older democracies. In the preface, in April 1900, he reflected what he had thought over the previous 7 years in authorizing the publication of this book, where he explains his current thinking. And now again, we're talking 1900, he says, practically, I really only came to know New York and Washington, and perhaps my observations are tainted by that limited scope. And it's perhaps not true, perhaps it's not true that those, or actually he believed that he who has seen New York and Washington has seen everything in the United States, a curious blind spot for someone so acute, intellectually acute. But basically, looking back at his youth, it proved to be more important than an in-depth examination of American society. It's clear that Mr. Nabuco had a very intensely social life in New York, certainly more so than in Washington. However, he had a very rich participation in Brazilian politics, in the ultimate proclamation of the Republic, the abolition of slavery. But this did not in any way. He was also happy to see the society organize itself in a Republican fashion, although he never abandoned his monarchist values, which allowed him to say on January 7, 1898, I find myself to be changing quite a bit. What changes is not the barometer, but the times. I'd like to live to the end a monarchist. However, I'd like to die reconciled with the new values adopted by my country, and therefore republicanism. Nabuco was prepared to return to public life, which is done more in a partisan fashion. To Desembargador Alves Ribeiro, he said, I don't wish to abandon my monarchist. I am and will remain a monarchist. But ultimately, that's secondary to me, an accident of life. The true characteristic of my life has always been liberalism. This doesn't seem to, in any event, lead the country to the values that are anxiously sought by him. As were indeed the case during the moments when, in October of 1895, was judged to be the duty of monarchists. From London, he wrote in 1890 earlier, says, why I continue to be a monarchist. Nabuco then lamented with the greatest emphasis the lack of preparedness in the country for a republican system. I suspect that between us, the republic will be minimized by the fixed, narrow scope of it. And he explains why. The axis of monarchy seems to be stronger, more elastic for the two wheels of progress, freedom and liberty. And I cannot see how this can be overcome by the electoral focus of the United States, because all of us know that this can be manufactured by any of us. Now here, by his continued adherence to monarchic principles and his fear of Republican values, the Republican government in Latin American countries is essentially simply casting aside freedom. Nabuco referred to the objective inability to truly ingrain republicanism in Brazil. In 1890, he recognizes that the degeneration of monarchism was the fundamental underpinning for the Republican Revolution. A revolution lacking feeling, because we arrived at where we are. He quotes approvingly the words of Herbert Spencer as to the American system. The Republican system of government is the noblest form of government. However, it requires the highest degree of the highest spirit of human nature. he lamented that Americans created a unique, singular style of republicanism with an energy and resolution over and above human body that form a new code of struggle for human life, a nervous, inventive, energy, electric man type of energy. This is not the United States. However, with the certainty of the restoration before us, the conviction that the Republic in Brazil will, unfortunately but certainly, assume an inferior style. And now the monarchy, he replies, we have no hope. You cannot be a monarchist without a hope of freedom. I can say that today I feel the loss of being in my own homeland. The only title the aristocrat Nabuco said in all these words in 1889 when he accepted Campos Sagres' offer to be the representative to the UK and headed the Brazilian mission in London. You can imagine what this meant to Nabuco the monarchist. Obviously, he lost most of his monarchist friends from the past. He received encouragement and endorsement from Princess Elizabeth upon his arrival. With the death of the head of the legation, he was offered the head of the embassy. Nabuco hesitated, preferring to leave this in the hands of the charge d'affaires. Later, however, he accepted, becoming then in August of 1899 a civil servant on behalf of the Republic. His relationship with the Republic, his mission will be arduous and demand all of his attentions over the years, cost him much physically, even though he had returned to live in the city that he had long loved during his trips to Scotland. My predecessor, Ivo Bitangi, had mentioned much about his London stay, which is his convivial life in the urban settings of London, leaving far behind the Amazon region. He brought with him a legal background, 2,000 odd pages. And Victor Emmanuel III, who decided the question solomonically, dividing the land between Guyana and with the advantage going to Britain. To accept this victory can hardly leave me unaffected as a Brazilian diplomat. However, with the invitation to Baron Dibat, who ultimately invited him to be the head of the Brazilian mission in Washington, Nabuco became the first Brazilian ambassador to Washington, when the United States was already an emerging world power, replacing Britain on the world map. He himself had already anticipated this and written this in his diary in Britain. Small, it doesn't so much matter politically, but financially, the United States will be every day more important to the world. In 1905, he leaves for Washington.
He says, well, as a parliamentarian, still within the empire, he was an idealist for abolitionism. And the third theme, the third mandate, in which he tried to form closer ties with England, and an enthusiast for the Monroe Doctrine. He wanted to create a new structure within the continent. But Nabuco, who then goes to the capital, he becomes another man, very distant from what he was 30 years before. In 1906, in his first trip to Brazil since he accepted his post in London. He says he speaks before the law school in Sao Paulo, and he says it was the first time that he speaks in public to a Brazilian audience as an ambassador, and hoping that all difficulties are overcome and all of my predictions from the past render impossible the incontestable emergence of republicanism on the continent. And he says in detail, no one has the right to say that he won't adhere to the system of his country, the political system, and my hope is that the greatest personalities in government, the greatest aptitudes, the purest qualities will ever be ever more ascendant as our institutions change. I can say that I love the American ideal, the Republican ideal, that's not only an American ideal, but a classical ideal, and I'll always be at the altar of Pericles. Nabucco, Theodore Roosevelt, Elliott Root. There was a perfect trio for a promising development of the Brazilian embassy in the United States. The ties of sympathy between Nabucco and Roosevelt showed themselves immediately when Roosevelt abandoned the speech that he was given in order to accept the new ambassador's credentials and affirm the faith in the future relations with the country. And Root found in Nabucco an interlocutor whom he could appreciate, a cultivated man of brilliant intelligence, and Nabucco immediately noticed that he was dealing with an aristocrat of thinking. Nabucco was captivated by the government with which he had contact, and he was surprised by the importance that was given to an ambassador from a relatively unimportant country, which Brazil was in the past, and all of the attentions that he wouldn't have received in England before the English court. So Nabucco felt at home. He never refused the opportunity to speak in public, whether at universities or before the press. He really appreciated the opportunity to speak before youngsters or young university students in a conference of the 20th of June of 1909. For example, in the University of Wisconsin, he spoke about America's share in civilization, where he demonstrated his dedication to new Republican values. Speaking about what would be the great contributions to the United States, the world civilization, he brings out the immigration, the factor of immigration and the formation of the American nation. And as our ambassador Mauro Vieira mentioned, for the first time, a great nation is formed through the voluntary immigration of peoples from all over the world, amalgamating voluntarily and not through the result of conquest. Choosing one's proper country was a universally unknown right until then, and through one's nationality, one could assert himself. After this great wave of immigration, democracy was strengthened. This is a distinctly American phenomenon and resulted in a very different situation. And democracy and republicanism emerged another and exported these ideals, and this became the American contribution to world civilization. And again, there emerges the voice of the great monarchies, not because the system of republican system should be considered the highest form of civilization, greater than a monarchical parliament, but why? Because of the encouragement that it lets, and the silent lesson of immigration. Your democracy has had the more beneficial effects over the monarchies of Europe, and thanks to its methods of colonial administration, and Nabucco recognizes the potential of American republicanism, and recognize all of the consequences of equality that he praised so highly, and even more rhetorically rather than through conviction, he recognizes the greatness of democracy in guaranteeing that public affairs would reside in the hands of the most capable, who would govern, as was mentioned before in the conference in São Paulo. The concern on the part of Nabuco and his analysis of the system in Chile, of the government in Chile. He returns to Washington on the occasion of the centenary of Lincoln's death, and goes back to the subject of American democracy and legal equality, and considers that one of the greatest achievements. And here we have one who doesn't conform himself to the slave situation and also the condition of the slaves once liberated. But it becomes clear once again that Nabuco's difficulty in accepting republicanism results in his disbelief that democracy would find root in Brazil, deep roots in Brazil, and because of the human condition of the country. Jaime Braça puts us in relief at the time which they shared their experiences in the American capital. His colleague wrote the great volume, The American Commonwealth. Nabuco was Bryce's friend, but through his writings, we can conclude that Nabuco caused the greatest impression on the part of Bryce than the other way around. What Nabuco says about Bryce and his comments on American society reveals how positive was his impression of his colleague, and this molded his judgment about the American scene. Now, let me quote a long quote. Let me quote some in length how he had converted to Bryce's vision of the greatness of American republicanism. Here it is. Yes, an English observer beside Tocqueville, is one of the classics of the 19th century about democracy in the United States, James Rice. He talks about the American people, and from this great book by Bryce, this great work, according to Bryce, they're very benevolent people, optimistic, with good humor, who exercise great conduct and temperance, veracity, integrity, the highest, and that is higher than any of the great countries of Europe. A religious people, everything that renders the individual independent and falls for short. A business-like people, capable of great idealism, above the English or the French. A rootless people, though, in the sense that no one is attached to the soil, attached to the land. They're sociable people, empathetic, unstable but not inconstant, and who deal with the volatile climate, basically conservative people in this sense. And in one word, Bryce says, America represents the highest level not only of material well-being but of intelligence and happiness greater than has ever been experienced by the human race. And he concludes, it seems that such a figure as this in the Gallery of Nations, in the constellation of nation figures among the nations, what in itself a great contribution to civilization. This is a picture of what Bryce said about American society. And Nabuco couldn't go beyond this. When his own country, when he lost his own monarchist friends, he recognized the benefits that republicanism brought. He had a clear notion of his role, not only within Brazil, but also throughout Latin America and the United States, or at least the United States that was represented through the such legendary figures as Abraham Lincoln and those who wanted to create a moral edifice through nationhood. And the strengthening of ties with the United States would represent a step towards continental peace, intercontinental peace, as he expressed to his friend José Carlos Rodrigues, and through me, when one wants to abandon the fight, the Brazilian continues. I don't know who will follow me at the embassy, whether he'll have the same intuition and a greater American intuition than myself. Thank you very much. I would like now to invite my fellow colleague from the Brazilian Academy of Letters, Elizabeth Hill, to speak.
Let me begin by thanking the Brazilian Embassy in Washington, the Academia Brasileira de Letras, and the Library of Congress, Ambassador Vieira, Dr. Vilaça, and Dr. Billington, for the invitation to speak at this, which is the latest of a series of seminars and conferences. This is actually my fourth, dedicated to the great Brazilian, great Pernambucano, Joaquim Nabuco, on the centenary of his death here in Washington in January 1910. I'm an honorary Pernambucano. My partner is from Pernambuco, and so I'm particularly pleased to join no less than 3 other Pernambucanos on this panel. We're in a clear majority this morning. I was asked to prepare 2 papers, and after the coffee break, I would like to talk about Joaquim Nabuco's thinking on Latin America and the United States. But now I would like to examine the role played by Joaquim Nabuco in the abolition of slavery in Brazil. In the middle of the 19th century, some 6 million Africans and African Americans were held in slavery in 3 remaining slave societies in the Americas. Over 3 million in the United States, 2 to 2.5 million in Brazil, 300 to 400,000 in the Spanish colony of Cuba. Slavery was abolished in the United States during and immediately after the American Civil War, when it was at its peak. It was not abolished in Cuba until 1880 and Brazil until 1888, in each case after protracted decline. So a little context first. Brazil's slave population had grown steadily throughout the first half of the 19th century, largely as a result of the massive annual injection of new slaves from Africa through the slave trade. The suppression of the transatlantic slave trade by the Brazilian government in 1850, under severe British pressure, dealt a decisive blow to Brazilian slavery. In contrast to the United States, where the slave population grew 3 or 4 times between the ending of the slave trade and the Civil War, in Brazil, the slave population entered a period of decline immediately after the suppression of the trade. Birth rates were low, mortality rates were high, the rate of manumission and the rate of escape, too, were relatively high. Nevertheless, Brazil's first national census in 1872 indicated a slave population of 1.5 million, 15 to 20% of Brazil's total population, compared with 25 to 35% in 1850. And although there'd been a significant relocation of Brazil's slave population from the north and northeast to the center-south, and within the center-south, from cities to countryside, from subsistence agriculture to plantation agriculture, from declining coffee areas to expanding coffee areas. Unlike the pre-Civil War United States, where slavery had become primarily a southern institution, slavery in Brazil remained a national institution. In 1870, slavery in Brazil was not doomed inevitably to wither away, at least not in the short and medium term. There were no signs of weakening of Brazilian slave owners' commitment to slavery. Slave owners and their political representatives in Parliament had no difficulty justifying slavery. Ideological rationalizations, especially those found on racism, were perhaps weaker in Brazil than in, for example, the American South, but the economic imperatives were just as strong. Despite individual voices denouncing slavery on the grounds of its injustice and its supposed economic inefficiency, there was no widely held abolitionist opinion in Brazil in 1870. It was the Emperor Dom Pedro II who put the future of slavery on the political agenda for the first time. He had come to believe that slavery in Brazil could no longer be justified and that its decline since 1850 was irreversible, should be accelerated, though in a gradual, controlled fashion, so as to ensure the minimum of economic and social dislocation. In April 1865, the month the American Civil War ended, he initiated legislation not only to improve the condition of the slaves, but to move towards gradual abolition. And after delays caused by the Paraguayan War, and after long and bitter debates in Parliament, a bill to free children born of slave mothers was finally enacted in September 1871. By cutting off the internal supply of slaves, 20 years after the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade had cut off the external supply, the law of free birth condemned slavery to eventual extinction. The clock was set ticking on the end of slavery in Brazil. But no single slave was emancipated by this law. And the law posed no immediate threat to any existing slave property. And as many who finally and reluctantly voted for it and intended, the passage of the 1871 law ended further debate in Parliament on the slavery issue for almost a decade. And in the meantime, the Brazilian slave population continued its steady decline and its regional and sectoral concentration, albeit still relatively slowly. At the end of the 1870s, there was still 1.25 million slaves in Brazil. When and why did Joaquim Nabuco become an abolitionist? First of all, there was the influence of his father, José Tomás Nabuco de Araújo, senator, member of the Council of State, Minister of Justice, responsible for the repression of the last attempts to import slaves into Brazil in the mid-1850s, and in the late 60s, one of the very few prominent politicians opposed to slavery. In a letter to his father in 1870, Nabuco, then a student at the law faculty in Recife, admitted that his greatest wish was to see his father president of the Council of Ministers for just 2 days, so that he could abolish slavery by decree and become o Lincoln Brasileiro, Brazil's Lincoln. Secondly, why did Nabuco become an abolitionist? Massangana. There's a well-known passage in Nabuco's autobiographical Minha Formação in which he describes a visit he made in 1869 to Massangana, the Engenho in Pernambuco, where he'd been born in 1849 and where he spent the first 8 years of his childhood. He entered the small enclosure behind the Capelinha de São Mateus that had been a cemetery for slaves. Standing amongst the crosses marking the graves, he reflected on the past and remembered the names of many of the slaves he had known as a child. There, he said, the problema moral de escravidão, the moral issue of slavery, came to my mind strongly for the very first time. And with it, the solução obrigatório, the only solution to the problem of slavery. So there I was, aged 20 years old, and I formed a resolution to devote my life to the service of a raça generosa, to the service of the slaves and ex-slaves, African, Afro-American, Brazilians. The driving force behind this opposition then, he claimed, was the querida y abençoada memoria of his childhood, the suffering of the Santos Pretos that he'd witnessed. That is to say, it was a personal, emotional, indeed sentimental, essentially moral commitment to bring slavery to an end. It's no coincidence that he claimed to have read Uncle Tom's Cabin thousands of times. Minha Formação, we should be careful. Minha Formação was written 30 years after the visit to Mangana. While there's no doubt that Nabuco was totally opposed to slavery throughout his life, there is in fact no evidence in his career or his correspondence and diaries that his decision to devote his life to the abolition of slavery was taken earlier than 1879, the year he entered Parliament for the first time. In the years following his graduation, slavery was not his central preoccupation. He entered his father's law firm, he dabbled with journalism and literature, and he wrote more about the separation of church and state than he did about abolition. And on his visits to Paris and London and Washington and New York in the 1870s, he never made contact with local abolitionists. In a lengthy student text written in 1870, soon after his visit to Mangana, and in all his later writings, including Abolitionism, written and published in London in 1883, different arguments were offered for Nabuco's opposition to slavery. It was a crime, an outrage against civilization, responsible for Brazil's backwardness, an obstacle to economic and political progress, and to the construction of a Brazilian nation. In September 1878, following the death of his father, who had prepared the ground, the 29-year-old Nabuco was elected to Parliament as a Liberal deputy for Pernambuco and took his seat in January 1879. His first speech was on the issue of religious freedom, not the emancipation of the slaves. It was left to a deputy from Bahia to put the abolition of slavery on the political agenda for the first time in almost a decade. But Nabuco soon adopted the issue as his own, and from 1879 until slavery was finally ended in May 1888, he was entirely dedicated to the cause, both inside and outside Parliament. The initiative that first brought Nabuco to national and international renown as a champion of slaves in Brazil was a speech in Parliament in September 1879 denouncing the British-owned São João del Rei Mining Company for continuing to own slaves, and illegally. The secretary of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society wrote immediately to congratulate him. And Nabuco, in reply, wrote, "I assure you, you will always find me at the fighting post I now occupy. I place the emancipation interest beyond any other, above any party allegiance or engagement. Compared to this great social reform, political reforms remain in the shade." He was strongly influenced by the British abolitionist William Wilberforce, and Nabuco therefore believed that abolition was a matter for Parliament only. Emancipation, he wrote to Charles Allen, cannot be done through a revolution, which would destroy everything. It will only be carried by a parliamentary majority. And he told Allen that he was planning to submit to Parliament a bill for the total abolition of slavery in Brazil on the 1st of January 1890, 10 years later. He did not expect it to pass in view of the existing strength of pro-slavery opinion in both the Liberal and the Conservative parties. But he planned to introduce it every session the way Wilberforce had done in London, every session until what he called the spread of moral conviction and increasing pressure from abolitionist opinion would eventually force its passage. The frontier of the next decade, Nabuco predicted, shall not be crossed in Brazil by any man calling himself a slave. The proposal Nabuco did put before Parliament was moderate. 10 years before total abolition and compensation for the slave owners, the way the British had done in the colonies half a century earlier. Nevertheless, the bill failed to make any progress. Only 18 deputies, 14 from the north, including 7 from Pernambuco, actually voted for an early debate on the abolition of slavery, and the bill was quietly withdrawn. In September 1880, Nabuco and a group of fellow abolitionists meeting in his home in Rio de Janeiro founded the Sociedade Brasileira contra a Escravidão, with Nabuco elected president. From the beginning, Nabuco emphasized the need to mobilize public opinion worldwide in support of the movement for emancipation in Brazil. Public opinion had not yet been mobilized in Brazil, and there was no sign of any weakening in the resistance to abolition in Parliament. But the Brazilian political elite, including the emperor, Nabuco believed, if not the slave owners, could be influenced by international, especially British and French, opinion. So in December, taking advantage of the parliamentary recess, Nabuco left for Europe to personally raise international awareness of the continued existence of slavery in Brazil, now the only country in the Americas with slavery and still over 1 million slaves. He met abolitionists in Lisbon, in Madrid. He met Spanish, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Filipino abolitionists in Madrid. He met leading abolitionists in Paris, but London was the main objective. The British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, which had been founded in 1839 after the emancipation of slaves in the British Empire, precisely in order to promote the abolition of slavery throughout the world. The Brazilian society, Nabuco regarded the British society as the first and most influential organization of its kind in the world, whose cooperation was essential in the fight against slavery in Brazil. Nabuco returned to Brazil in April 1881, and when the Chamber of Deputies was dissolved in June, with nothing achieved on abolition, Nabuco offered himself as a candidate for the first district of the Corte, the capital, Rio de Janeiro, in the elections of October 1881, and he was defeated. Nabuco was now forced to act outside Parliament, mainly writing articles for the press. And in his frustration, and despite being accused by some abolitionists of too readily abandoning the cause, he left Brazil and returned to London in December 1881. During his stay in London, this time for 2.5 years, Nabuco earned his living as a correspondent of the Jornal do Comércio and as a lawyer advising English firms with investments in Brazil. But he devoted much of his time to promoting the cause of abolition. In July 1882, he unsuccessfully, but he did petition Parliament again, not for abolition in 10 years, but now abolition either immediately or within a very short period to be defined immediately. But he still favored indemnifying slave owners for the loss of their slaves. So Nabuco had moved considerably, but there was still some way to go. He researched and wrote O Abolicionismo, which is one of his greatest works, and he worked closely with the British Anti-Slavery Society. The idea was to set up an efficient propaganda scheme. He gave information to Charles Allen, the secretary of the society. He released it to the press, especially the London Times, which Nabuco referred to as a voz da civilização. And the Times had enormous influence inside and outside Britain, not least in Brazil. Nabuco's strategy of internationalizing the struggle for abolition in Brazil was not without risk. During his journey in Europe, he was accused by supporters of slavery of sullying the name of Brazil abroad by disclosing, washing dirty linen abroad, disclosing the evils of slavery, and therefore lacking patriotism. And this accusation concerned him deeply. He came back to it time after time. He defended himself time after time. In Abolicionismo, Nabuco denounced what he called a corrupção do patriotismo, the use of patriotism to defend the indefensible, to defend an institution condemned by the entire civilized world. Fundamentally, Nabuco believed the abolition of slavery was a question of civilization, of moral progress of humankind, of the spread of universal values, which in the end no country could escape. No action, he thought, that tried to raise Brazil to the level of civilization already achieved by other nations in this regard, slavery, could possibly be considered unpatriotic. Nabuco returned to Brazil from London in May 1888. He was in poor health, he'd been working too hard, he needed a holiday, he was suffering from homesickness and what he said, the want of my native son. 2.5 years in London is enough to drive anyone to total despair. But his decision was also influenced by the fact that the abolitionist movement outside Parliament had gained considerable momentum during his absence. There were a growing number of abolitionist meetings, Rio, Recife, other cities, huge crowds, including Afro-Brazilians. A Confederação Abolicionista of various provincial societies had been formed and committed to immediate abolition without indemnification. Much of the Rio press, José de Patrocínio was active in the columns of the Gazeta de Noticias. The great caricaturista Angelo Agostini was contributing to the Revista Ilustrada, and the Gazeta da Tarde in particular was committed to abolition. And in March 1884, Ceará became the first of Brazil's provinces to emancipate its slaves. Perhaps, Nabuco told Alan before he left, the moment had arrived for some energetic kind of action on his part. In June 1884, Dom Pedro II, recognizing the growing strength of abolitionism as a national political movement, invited Senator Manuel Pinto de Sousa Dantas to form a government prepared to introduce the first anti-slavery legislation since the law of free birth 13 years before. But even now, legislation for gradual, not immediate, abolition. Dantas introduced a bill to free slaves over 60, and there weren't too many slaves over 60. It was radical only in the sense that it represented the first direct challenge to existing slave property in Brazil. Moreover, no compensation would be offered to the owners of slaves over 60. But Dantas failed. He failed to unify the Liberal Party. He was defeated at the end of July. The emperor granted the dissolution of Parliament, and Nabuco immediately became a candidate for the first district of Pernambuco, the city of Recife. And in the great election campaigns in Recife in December 1884, Nabuco campaigned for the first time on a platform of immediate abolition without compensation, an indication of how the radicalization of the abolitionist movement since 1883 had radicalized Nabuco, who of course needed to maintain his leadership of the movement. He drew crowds of thousands at meetings in the Teatro Santa Isabel in Recife. He eventually won the seat at the second attempt. The first was declared invalid, only for the chamber, when it met in May, to overturn the result and give the seat to a conservative candidate. But with the death of a deputy in the 5th district of Pernambuco, Nabuco finally was re-elected to the Brazilian parliament in June 1885. Before Nabuco finally re-entered parliament, after an absence of 4 years, Dantas's bill had been defeated a second time, and Dantas was forced to resign. A much milder version of the bill, which was bitterly opposed by Nabuco, was passed in September 1885. Under the Saraiva-Cotegipe law, better known as the sexagenarian law, slaves aged 60 and over would be freed, but forced to work for 3 more years, at which point the slave owners would receive compensation for their emancipation. You can see why Nabuco was bitterly opposed to this compromise. The law did little to accelerate the end of slavery. Fewer than 20,000 slaves over 60 were freed under the law during its first 12 months. New elections were held on the 15th of January 1886, and Nabuco was again candidate for Recife. But again he was defeated in a conservative landslide. Disenchanted and disillusioned, and this was the period when he finally broke with his great love, Eufrasia, in April 1886. So his personal life was in disarray, and his political life as an abolitionist was in disarray. And Nabuco spent most of 1886 writing for the Rio Press, publishing pamphlets, including O Erro do Imperador, O Eclipse do Abolicionismo, in which he bitterly criticized the emperor for having first encouraged the abolitionists with the choice of Dantas, and then surrendering the government, first to the anti-abolitionist liberal, José Antonio Saraiva, and then to the uncompromisingly pro-slavery conservative, João Maurício Vanderlei, o Barão de Cotegipe.
Professor Leslie, desculpe interrompê-lo.
Excuse me for interrupting you. But it actually leads me to want to know your ultimate conclusions. Dr. Billington is going to have to leave for a previous commitment, and he would simply like a few words to congratulate everyone. If you could just stand down for a few minutes, and because we would like to issue an invitation to Dr. Billington to visit us at the Academy in Brazil. So if you could just give us a minute. I was only going to go 5 minutes longer. Excuse me, but Dr. Billington likes Brazil so much that he simply wanted to apologize. If we could have a coffee break now, then we would pick back up. We have Deborah McKern here. You would undoubtedly like to know her. She's the director of the office in Brazil. So during the coffee break, I apologize for interrupting you here. Let us just now have a few moments for a coffee break. Ladies and gentlemen, again, apologizing to our dear friend, Professor Leslie Bethel, for this interruption. We would ask him then to conclude his remarks.
Thank you very much. I think I'll start again and do the whole thing. I've lost track. I have to start again. We reached the point, I was reaching the conclusion in any case, that it's interesting to see Nabuco attempting to be re-elected as late as January 1886 and failing. And we see how disillusioned he was in 1886, and with his personal problems, emotional problems at the same time, he became rather bitterly critical of the emperor. And he went eventually back to London yet again. He loved going back to London. Nabuco was very much involved with London and loved returning to London. But he didn't stay long this time, because the appointment of a deputy as Minister of the Empire, under the rules of the Empire at the time, meant there had to be a special election in Recife before the deputy could become a minister. Nabuco contested that election in September 1887, defeated the minister in what was probably, maybe apart from December 1884, this was the most memorable campaign in which Nabuco mobilized not only voters but non-voters, and played a major role in reinvigorating the entire abolitionist campaign, which had been driven so low after the failure of the Dantas Bill and the Compromise Saraiva-Cotigipe Bill. And the general mood was one of some despair, and the election of September 1887 did a great deal to reinvigorate the abolitionist campaign. Because following the 1885 law, no further measures towards the liberation of Brazil's remaining 750,000 slaves, maybe still almost 1 million slaves, was expected from the conservative Cotigipe government, and none was forthcoming. The political representatives of the slave-owning elite in Parliament continued for the most part to regard slavery as both indispensable and legitimate. Neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives in Parliament favoured outright abolition, even as late as 1887. Slavery was to be allowed to die naturally. But some abolitionists calculated that on this basis it could be another 30 years before slavery disappeared. And even the most optimistic expected the process of natural decline to take between 8 and 10 years. But in 1887, the slave system's natural decline was accelerated as a result of two new factors. First, the mass desertion of the coffee plantations of São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and eventually Rio de Janeiro, by slaves, encouraged and aided by the abolitionist movement outside Parliament, which had become increasingly radical. And this was facilitated by the refusal of many junior army officers either to maintain order in the countryside or to pursue and capture fugitive slaves. The second factor was the increase in the voluntary liberation of slaves by owners, who now were afraid of the total disintegration of the plantation labor system. And in return for freedom, they secured promises to remain on the plantation for up to 3 years from liberated slaves. Equally significant was the fact that the coffee fazendeiros of the north and west of São Paulo, where the demand for labor, slave labor, was greatest by this time, they were finally driven to find an alternative source of labor in the form of subsidized European, mainly Italian, immigration. São Paulo received 5,000 European immigrants in 1884, 6,500 in 1885, 9,500 in 1886, 32,000 in 1887, and in 1888, 92,000 European immigrants arrived in São Paulo, 750,000 in the decade after abolition. Joaquim Nabuco made one more contribution to the abolition of slavery. The emperor was in Europe for medical treatment, leaving his daughter, Princess Isabel, well known for the strength of her religious sentiments, as regent. In November, as is well known, Nabuco traveled to Europe, and after waiting around in Rome for almost a month, he finally got a meeting with the Pope and persuaded Pope Leo XIII to issue a papal encyclical condemning slavery. By the beginning of 1888, Brazil's political leaders were being forced to face the fact that the slave system was clearly breaking down. And there were fears, exaggerated fears, but fears nonetheless, of a major social upheaval accompanying the final stages of slavery. In Parliament, the majority of liberals were now, finally, in favor of abolition. The conservatives were divided, but in March, João Alfredo Correa de Oliveira, the leading figure of the reformist wing of the Conservative Party, indicated to Princess Isabel his willingness to form a government committed to emancipating Brazil's remaining slaves. And by March 1888, the institution of slavery had declined to the point where there were between 250,000 and 500,000 slaves, but still 250,000 and 500,000 slaves. Nabuco was in London at the time, immediately returned to Brazil, addressed a huge abolitionist rally in the Teatro Santa Isabel in Recife on the 12th of April. On the 18th of April, he was back in Rio, ready for the reopening of Parliament and ready to lead the final battle for abolition. On the 8th of May, a bill for the immediate abolition of slavery without compensation was submitted to the Chamber of Deputies. Nabuco, the historic leader of the abolitionists in Parliament, though still only 38 years old, took it upon himself to ensure that the bill passed rapidly as a matter of urgency. In particular, he ensured that the Liberals supported it, even though it was a Conservative government bill, and he persuaded the Chamber to dispense with its normal timetable for legislation. The bill was approved by 83 votes to 9, mostly diehards in the province of Rio de Janeiro, on its second reading on the 9th of May. Senator Dantas took responsibility for the bill in the Senate, where it was approved on its second reading on the 12th of May, with only 6 votes against, including Cotigipe. On the 13th of May, after the bill's third and final reading in the Senate, Joaquim Nabuco, who for almost a decade since 1879 had played a central role in the slow and until 1887 uncertain progress of the abolitionist cause, inside and outside Parliament, in Brazil and outside Brazil, especially in London, Nabuco had the satisfaction of addressing a large and enthusiastic crowd from the window of the Paço da Cidade, the current Paço Imperial, where the Princess Regent had signed the law declaring slavery in Brazil extinct and liberating all of Brazil's remaining slaves. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor Lelis Betel, pela qualidade da sua comunicação, o que referenda na academia o acerto da sua escolha como sócio correspondente. Gostaria, neste momento, de dar a palavra ao professor Jackson.
Thank you very much. For the honor of the invitation, I'd like to thank Mr. Billington, Dr. Georgette Dorn and the Library of Congress, Ambassador Vieira and the Brazilian Embassy, and Dr. Vilaça and the Brazilian Academy. I'd like to speak to you first today about Joaquim Nabuco, author and correspondent, and particularly his correspondence with Brazil's author, Machado de Assis. Thus, my talk to you carries the title, Nabuco to Machado, Machado to Nabuco, Resonance of Our Correspondence. It's a correspondence that covers a period of 43 years. Novelist and essayist Graça Aranha was the first to collect and annotate this correspondence in 1923, and throughout the 20th century there were a number of other publications. But after 50 years, this correspondence has once again come to the attention of readers and scholars with the republication by the Brazilian Academy of Letters in 2003 of the commentary and notes by Graça Aranha with a new study by José Murilo de Carvalho. The first two volumes of an edition of the complete correspondence of Machado are now available, organized by Irene Moutinho and Silvia Eleutério in 2008-2009. This correspondence calls our special attention because of its literary themes and concerns, even when the authors are speaking of practical or political matters. It is this literary and aesthetic atmosphere that unites the two writers, as Machado observes on January 5th, 1902. In spite of the difference in our ages, we are from a time in which we exchanged our literary and political impressions, long before email. Caution is still advised in the reading of these letters, however, because of the many unexpected dimensions found between the lines. There are signs throughout the correspondence indicating that Machado found in Nabuco certain characteristics of his literary characters. Rouanet comments in an interview with O Globo, "I was just leafing through the chronicles in A Semana Ilustrada, and in 1895, on commenting Un Estadista do Império by Nabuco, Machado uses a metaphor from Dom Casmurro about characters that spring out of the pages." The first letter from Machado, sent to London in 1882, is novelesque in the spirit of his Memorias Póstumas de Brás Cubas, dealing with nothing less than an epitaph, telling that their mutual friend, the Comendador Joaquim Arsenio Sintra da Silva, consul of Bolivia, Paraguay, and Venezuela and Brazil, had engraved on the tombstone of his young wife, Dona Marianinha Teixeira Leite, some of the words, quote, of emotion, truth, and poetry that Nabuco had published in homage to the distinguished lady in the Jornal do Comércio on August 21st, 1881. 14 years later, in a development worthy of one of his novels, Machado again writes to Nabuco, reminding him of Marianinha's death so many years past, with a message that Joaquim Arsenio had selected for his second wife's tomb some of the same words with which Nabuco remembered the first one, quote, struck down in the height of life like the angels of the Bible in sparkling vestments that hardly touched the earth. This was enough for Nabuco to ironize 4 years later from Paris, while replying to a letter from Machado on December 6, 1889. "When I first saw your handwriting, I thought it might be a third edition of the famous epitaph. Please tell me that's the case." Grounded on the story of this epitaph and on the impressions of brilliance and literary style that Nabuco made on Machado, the correspondence takes on a new rhythm only after 1896 and intensifies some eight years later. In this phase, 1896 to 1904, the letters are sporadic, one or two a year, separated by long intervals. They continue to be formal and rhetorical, changing only in the very last phase, 1906 to 1908, to touch on personal matters, reaffirming and reinforcing the mutual respect maintained over many years. The majority of the letters exchanged between the writer and the diplomat, 19 from Nabuco and 29 from Machado, were written in those 12 years when Nabuco had reached the age of 50 and Machado 60. The letters follow a period of closeness and friendship between the two in Rio de Janeiro, when, in the words of Carolina Nabuco, now in the Republic, they met daily in the afternoons to converse in the Garnier bookstore, which was the meeting place of intellectuals, later at the Revista Brasileira, and finally at the Academy of Letters, of which the two, along with Lúcio de Mendonça, were the principal founders. In the second letter that Machado writes to him on May 29, 1882, two themes appear that testify to the profound impression that Nabuco was to make on Machado, determining perhaps the timbre and rhythm of their mutual exchanges. Moved by the beauty of the homage that Nabuco had written for Marianinha, Machado promises him a brilliant future in the guise of a fortune teller. "Your time will come. You have youth, faith, and future. Your star must shine for the joy of your friends and the confusion of those envious. It is a fortune reminiscent of the words of the caboclo to Natividade on the Morro do Castelo in the first chapter of Esau e Jacó. They will be great, oh, very great. Your sons will be glorious, and that's all I will tell you. As for the quality of the glory, things of the future. In the second letter, Machado already attributes to Nabuco the aesthetic and philosophical superiority of a literary character. He says, "The impression that you make on me is that a Greek would make, we may suppose, from the good times of the Iliad and the disenchanted spirit of a Buddhist." Throughout the years, Machado continues to praise Nabuco's advanced and moderate style and his knowledge of things. A second theme that Machado brings up concerning Nabuco on May 29, 1882, and that he will reinforce in letters to follow, comes out of the story of Marianinha's epitaph again. He says, "I understand your nostalgia, and no less do I understand the consolation brought about by absence." Machado associates these themes with the exile of a diplomatic counselor, for whom memory at times must substitute for reality. He says, "For us, your friends, if there is any consolation, it is the tempering that this exile must necessarily give you." It is in this theme that one finds perhaps the most profound nature of the relationship that continues to mark future correspondence. A special condition beginning in 1882 is Nabuco's exile as a diplomat, whose letters always arrive from outside Brazil, 4 French, 6 English, and 7 North American, such that Graça Aranha alleged that Machado de Assis was the imaginary companion of those peregrinations. The distant image that each had of the other guided and determined the content of their correspondence, above the concrete matters with which it dealt. Letters from overseas intensified an abstract, symbolic, and cathartic image of the other. Traces began to appear of a double, an imaginative and complex composite through which the two discovered secret affinities caused by distance. If one considers Nabuco in Europe to be a latent double from Machado's point of view, his own transatlantic letters indicate a division of the self. The double acquires the sense of a projection, or being divided between the world of Rio de Janeiro and the old world, which for Machado is the sphere of his intellectual development and the philosophical and literary origin of his library. For Nabuco, Europe is a long-sought exile, a return to the origins of culture, but equally a separation from the future he also desires and hopes to realize in national politics. According to the philosophical and psychological theories of the double, the projection of oneself onto another may consist in attributing to the other that which the self desires but is outside of its grasp. Nabuco and Machado, we may then think, project themselves in terms of the geography of each other. Machado is delighted to receive Tasso's branch, supreme poetic present pruned by Nabuco in Italy, and Nabuco selects the members of the Academy while writing from Europe. There is a theoretical ambiguity in their mutual projection, however, that involves the symbolic exchange of identities. One finds in the other qualities that he does not possess, but with which he identifies. He can resent the other for this reason, making the other figure at the same time strange and familiar, since he represents the desire of being another, but at the same time presents a way of making this latent desire possible. These are some of the dimensions that I mentioned hidden between the lines in the history of this correspondence. The case of the famous epitaph continues to mark the correspondence, dominated by themes of death, exile, and epistolary consolation. Machado sends yet another letter to Europe on January 5, 1902, intimating that 2 lines are enough to remind you of the heart that keeps the memory of those far away and beats to the rhythm of the affection and of past days. The meaning of this sentiment becomes sharper for Machado with the death of his wife, Carolina, on October the 20th, 1904, and her absence becomes a transcendent rather than only a geographic reality. He mourns the catastrophe in a letter to Nabuco on November the 20th, in which he expresses gratitude for the solitude that allows him to live more intensely with the memory of his loved one, further observing in an aphorism that vigilance augments the absence of the loved one. Nabuco tries to cheer him up in a letter on November 17, 1904, with words that Machado accepts as high, exact, and true, with which the diplomat alleges rhetorically that it was an act of mercy for Carolina to die first because widows suffer tragically, and because the widower can compensate the vacuum in his heart with the consolation of another romance, which will constitute our language's greatest debt to the tomb in whose shadow you are going to reside. In his sadness, Machado seems to associate Carolina's absence with Nabuco's exile, to their old affection, and perhaps to Nabuco's elevation as ambassador to the United States, which Machado mentions in a letter on January 11, 1905, addressed to "My dear ambassador." It does not seem to be by chance that after Nabuco's visit to Rio de Janeiro for the Pan American Conference in 1906, Machado announces the idea of writing a new and last book in a letter on February 7, 1907. He says, "I don't know if I will have time to give form and substance to the book that I have in mind to sketch. If I can, it certainly will be my last." He refers to Councilor Iris's memoir, Memorial de Iris, the novel diary of an old diplomat who returns to Brazil after a life spent abroad, having left the tomb of his wife in Europe. Considering the early example from Dom Casmurro of a wife abandoned to die in Europe, the case of Capitu, could it not be that in the Memorial, Machado may have thought about literally exchanging roles with his correspondent by creating the character of the conselheiro, which the author now announces clandestinely by letter to the diplomat narrator himself? In the last letter Machado writes on August 1st, 1908, he announces the mailing, quote, of my Memorial de Iris, and adds an intriguing phrase, quite possibly of dissimulation, hidden in his homage. "You will tell me what you think of it." The narrator's self-projection on the diplomat seems to be confirmed in the symbol of the yellow flower used by Conselheiro Iris and by Nabuco on their respective lapels, symbol of eternal youth. Curiously, Machado had refused to accept the title of conselheiro, which was abolished by the Republic. In an article written in 1926, the critic João Ribeiro lamented not being able to call Conselheiro Machado. It would have been suitable, he says, for the emperor to give him the title of conselheiro as he gave to Rui Barbosa. Conselheiro Machado would have resolved our hesitations. In defense of the title, he pointed out that neither does it involve nobility or any kind of privilege save that of human spirit and prudence. Such was the counselor of the novel planned by Machado in the form of a diary and a memorial at the apex of his correspondence with the actual diplomat. A third theme in which Machado perceives a deep affinity with Nabuco appears in the interesting letter of August 19, 1906, which is strangely absent from Machado's Obras Completas, in which Machado comments on Nabuco's book of thoughts and reminiscences, the Pensées détachées souvenirs, published in Paris in the same year. In the letter, Machado praises the existence in Nabuco of the public man and the thinker. This work comes to show us that in the midst of grave matters of state, you didn't deny your artistic faculties that came first and that created a literary career for you. He shares with the author of the Pensées détachées a taste for the succinct expression of ideas and philosophical reflections, as he confesses. From early on, I read Pascal, not to cite many other names besides his, and I promise you it was not just for distractions. Even today, when I return to such readings and console myself with the disconsolate Ecclesiastes, I found in them the same taste of old. On commenting the style of these pages by Nabuco, it seems that Machado is describing the technique that he himself used in many of his own writings. He says, "Thoughts gain their value and live through precise or new observation, through sharp or profound reflections, nor do they desire originality less, the simplicity and grace of a phrase. In these pages is the alternating history of religious and philosophical influence, of moral and aesthetic observations, and of personal experience, now over a long time. Its interior is here open to be viewed by that lapidary form that our memory retains better. You inscribe them in direct or suggestive ways, and a spiritual note is still to be found on your pages, which from all shines a serene and strong optimism." With his strong imagination, Machado sees entire books in some selected examples of the thoughts that he comments on. His choices are surprising because of the closeness of the aphorisms to his well-known novels. He says, "Very rarely are beautiful lives happy on the inside. Many things must always be sacrificed for unity." It's a quote from one of the aphorisms, one that he chose to evoke historical memories or direct observations, and in someone's hands, a writer or a psychologist could make a good book of it. He further comments on the efficacy of orthography for better teaching a political lesson, and quotes the aphorism, "Often a life is lost because in place of a final period, one risks a question mark." And he notes the origin of many sayings considered to be philosophical from the mouths of the people. By a direct and earthy route, if there existed an office to exchange the happiness that some envy in others, everyone would go there to exchange his own. Very much in his own manner, Machado even cites a reflection that highlights all of our thoughts and makes them doubtful. In another aphorism, "The butterfly finds them heavy, the peacock poorly dressed, the nightingale hoarse, and the eagle common." For Machado, this genre goes far beyond the merely poetic to express beauty, truth, and longing and mystery, even going beyond philosophy to what words themselves cannot express. It is his own writing of maxims. In his own writing, maxims are made even more suggestive and penetrating, contributing a special flavor to the plot. Words, verbs, expressions that dress things make up his imaginary game, the gymnastics of a secret camera. The marvelous malabarist, after letting his phrases drag on, makes them suddenly make a jump, and he enjoys like a willful acrobatics that entertains him, and charms us. In his closing letter, Machado comments on the rereading of Masangana, a chapter of Minha Formação, which takes him back to the theme of absence and memoirs, tied to Carolina and to his new novel in the making. On considering the portrait of life on the northeastern plantation, he raises the image of a past world lost forever. Everything there, from the work bell to the worker's patience, the old godmother, the lady of the estate and her young maid, everything breathes that past that will not return, not even with the heartaches of a formerly young man, nor with the cynicisms in the brain of the current thinker. This is the supreme affinity that Machado recognizes in Nabuco, united in their loss of the past, brought to mind in the portraits and sentiments that Machado feels in his reading of Masangana. Both men evoke that past, revisiting the innocence of youth through the bitterness of old age. In 1906, the reading of Nabuco's Pensées détachées and of Masangana are reflected directly in Machado at the moment when he was conceiving his last novel, to which he seems to allude between the lines of his salutation, "Goodbye, my dear Nabuco, I thank you one more time for the impression you made on me." Nabuco's letters to Machado, in conclusion, are equally personal and affectionate, even if highly rhetorical. Besides the political matter of the organization of the Brazilian Academy of Letters and the naming of its members, a treacherously political process, his letters always turn to literary subjects. Theirs is a generation of avid readers who constantly read each other. Nabuco congratulates Machado on his new novel in the letter of June 2nd, 1900, confessing that he had sipped it at the fountain. Nabuco and Graça Aranha, you see, had read the proofs of Dom Casmurro in Paris thanks to a lapse by the publisher who violated Machado's instructions not to reveal what was in his books before they were printed, even to intimate friends, as Graça Aranha confessed. Returning from Chicago in 1908, Nabuco immediately read the novel that was waiting for him. He found it disconsolate and soon recommended to its author a prolonged and constant bath of youth. It was not the first time that he took on the role of counselor. In 1904, he tried to cheer up Machado after the death of Carolina. In your case, he says, the imagination, intellectual interest, and work create an atmosphere that in part allows the pain to evaporate wholly. You will understand that the heart's emptiness must be compensated by the revival and stirring of your spirit. Always in the context of a friend's confidence, some of his observations, although brief and more elusive than concrete, stand out for their perceptiveness as precursors of the critical judgments later applied to Machado's work. Later, writing from London on October 8, 1904, while lamenting the negative decision about the demarcation of Brazil's border with Guyana, he distinguishes the fictional works from the letters of the celebrated author. Quote, "But what vivacity, what lightness, what sweetness, what benevolence of spirit, I was going to say, what beatitude. You may cultivate a bladder of bile for your social philosophy and your novels, but your letters betray you. You are not only a happy man, you live in beatitude as suits a pope, and pope of an age of faith, as such is felt today in the Academy. Now you're not going to say that I've offended you and accused you of hypocrisy by calling you happy." Nabuco's observation on Machado is confirmed by a statement by Rouanet concerning the unpublished letters that he was preparing for publication in 2008. And he says, "Reading these letters according to their chronological flow day after day, we see a new Machado. His youthful letters do not support the stereotype of a sullen type, self-absorbed, antisocial, and cold in human relations. Young Machado, Machadinho, was a trickster, bohemian, who romanced all the French actresses. Rouanet does accept, however, the thesis according to which Machado became more pessimistic and negative with age. The letters deconstruct the stereotype that is true for the second Machado. The melancholy, pessimistic figure is built up over time and above all in his old age. And still in the last phase from 1905 to 1908, yet another matter brings Machado and Nabuco together, which is Nabuco's nomination as the first Brazilian ambassador in Washington, D.C. in January 1905. Machado writes, "You know how sincere is my wish to see you raised up by Brazil to where your capacity deserves." In this new phase, Machado dedicates himself to the recognition of the language in which he writes and in which the new republic speaks, to be promoted by Nabuco in a new alliance with the North American Republic. In this light, Machado compliments him for his addresses read in the Jornal do Comércio and congratulates him for the honorary doctorate from Yale University. Commenting on his 3 lectures on Camões in a letter of June 28, 1908, Machado returns to the place and primacy of the Portuguese language, whether in the Pan-American Union or in the American intellectual climate. Machado writes, "Thank you for all of them, and particularly for the one about the place of Camões in literature. It's good, even indispensable, to claim for our language the place it deserves, and for this end, the international political service is no less important than purely literary ones. It is really sad to see us considered, as you say, in a subaltern position to the Spanish language. Thus, once more, you will be an ambassador of our spirit, with an embrace for the distinctions you have been receiving there and which are meant for all of Brazil." With the two figures at the height of their literary abilities, committed to achieving recognition for their country and their language on the world stage, the correspondence ends with Machado's death on September 29, 1908, leaving a counselor, a public man far from Brazil, and another literary one still strolling through the pages of his last novel. Thank you very much.
Agradeço vivamente ao professor Lélio Betão.
I thank Professor Bethel sincerely for the news contribution on Nabuco, now permanently wed to Machado de Assis. I can't tell you how much we appreciate your enlightening us as to that bond. We all know how relevant the presence of Nabuco in the parliament proved to be. Nabuco was an extraordinary deputy, praiseworthy, praised. Some would even say that he was the most ethical of his time amongst all the congressmen, parliamentarians in Brazil. His speeches truly captivated his audiences, and no one better than a Brazilian doctor, an Oxford professor, and a fan of the Caparibe soccer team from Pernambuco. Who better to address us now? And I offer the floor then to Congressman Mauricio Hunt. Good afternoon to everyone, to all present here in this year of Joaquim Nabuco's centenary, or the centenary of his death, which occurred here in the United States, January 19th, 1910. We in Brazil in the National Congress, by initiative of Senator Marco Maciel, who coincidentally is from the same hometown as Joaquim Nabuco, and we declared 2010 the International Year of Joaquim Nabuco. I'd like to thank then Ambassador Mauro Vieira, the president of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, who's sitting in the seat that was Machado de Assis at one time, Dr. Marco Vilaça, the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, and all others on this panel where we can reflect on the historic moment of this legendary Brazilian and the work of someone who was a writer, diplomat, politician, social reformer, and really an artist too. When we think as to whom the true founders of Brazil were, the founding fathers, as the United States has, as other countries of Latin America has, we in Brazil have difficulty in speculating who really are our founding fathers. In Chile, we know that Bernardo O'Higgins was a founding father. In Argentina, Belgrano, with his emphasis on participation in the independence process of that country, General San Martin. In Venezuela, Francisco de Miranda, and Simon Bolivar. Here in the United States, and I'm a great admirer of the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison. None of these countries produce much controversy, but Marcos Vilaça recently published a gallery of who the genuine founders or the most significant founders of the Brazilian Republic were, and Nabuco was not included. And I went to Aldo Ribeiro and said, we have to broaden our consideration of who the true architects were. And I dare say that given the scope of his work, his vision, his premonitions, Joaquim Nabuco rightfully deserves a place in whatever list of founding fathers next to José Bonifácio Machado de Assis, the representatives of the dynasty, Rio-Branco, who was our top diplomat, as well as instrumental in the definition of our geographic and territorial limits. I don't think it would be too much to say, though, that Joaquim Nabuco truly deserves to be among their like. Our president, in his remarks, said that when we celebrate Nabuco's written works, we are up against a true avalanche of suggestions and issues. Nabuco addresses the question of art, national construction, Pan-Americanism, faith, and a literature where faith, creationism, evolution is all discussed in works that he wrote in French, in France, that later was translated into Portuguese as the work My Faith, seeking to justify logically his belief, the reaffirmation that he at the time effected his reconnection with the Catholic Church. So Nabuco that talks about the Republic and politics is a Nabuco that impresses us by his diversity, by the scope and breadth of his concerns. I'd like, before I got any further into the discussion of Nabuco as a social reformer who so impressed Gilberto Freire, who referred in 1950 to the fact that Brazil was commenting the centenary of Rui Barbosa, another great Brazilian, but ran the risk of omitting mention of Joaquim Nabuco in the centenary of his birth. In 1949, he was born in 1849 in the Rua da Imperatriz, the Empress's Road, in our Recife. Anyhow, this work that so impressed not only Gilberto Freire, but so many of us, I'd like to say that Joaquim Nabuco with the variety of his concerns and talents, he too had moments that perhaps were not so praiseworthy. He was always a bad administrator in terms of his personal finances. Much of his life he lived with financial difficulties. When he marries the daughter of the Baron of Doha, owner of many lands, he invested all of his dowry, when dowries were still available, in Buenos Aires. However, soon thereafter, the Argentine economy tanked, and he lost every penny. This was the opposite of one of his great loves, Eufrasia Teixeira Leite, whom he kept a romance up with for 18 years through 1886. She, on the other hand, was a wise investor, made a great fortune, and her family, knowing or foreseeing the imminent death of agriculture in Paraíba, scooped up her entire family wealth in Paraíba to save her family's financial reputation. This relationship ended in 1896, and the distance that led him astray from her and into political life led the relationship to ultimately end. Still, he spent much of his time, especially in the pre-abolition years in Brazil. He too complained of her political position, when he became more radical in the abolitionist movement. There's a host of letters from Eufrasia Teixeira Leite saying that those policies were causing her problems in her social circle, so that side of Joaquim Nabuco that loved the good life, that for some of his biographers has been treated as a dandy of sorts. Still, this is another interesting facet of his personality. Perhaps he was following Luis Barreto and Castro Alves when he fell for famous actresses as they coursed through Recife or Rio de Janeiro, even Princess Elizabeth. At theater shows, Luis Barreto and Castro Alves, all of them at the time in law school, leaders of the so-called School of Recife, but romantic abolitionists like Castro Alves, who fell in love with the actress Câmara, and the other with the actress Amaral, that always came through Rio performing with European theaters, but the public noticed the rival passions of these two. So perhaps Joaquim Nabuco followed down the same road, and his somewhat agitated personal life, love life, only became stabilized at the age of 40, when 1889, when he married Eveline, as I say, the daughter of the Baron of Doha, of the owner whose father owned large property holdings near Rio de Janeiro. And her passion for the cause of abolitionism, also made envious and hardly understanding other members of their liberal circles, which he, as a cosmopolitan, had many of. For instance, Tobias Barreto, who was an icon of the Recife school at the law school. Although he gave lip service to abolitionism, in truth, That issue really never interested him, even though he was a half-breed mestizo. He really never signed on to that cause. I was unable to find the specific text, but I recall this from university. Sometimes you only remember things years later, but when Joaquim Nabuco went to Recife as a deputy, favoring abolitionism, he made Barreto jealous by saying, and not in poetic language, perhaps, but he showed his passion, his spontaneous attachment to the cause of abolitionism, and to be, as Barreto said, more or less, you who come from afar from London with your eloquent language, to this simpler people, you come to teach us what blackness means. What you write makes no sense at all. What you say has no weight. Don't be a fool, Nabuco. Clearly betraying jealousy, I would say. So this, too, was another facet of the personality of Joaquim Nabuco. But still, let me back up and highlight and say that perhaps the most lasting contribution, or at least the one that most touched me, as it did Gilberto Freire, is Joaquim Nabuco, the social reformer, an aristocrat, son of a senator, grandson of a senator, nephew of an imperial senator, ultimately took on, and emphatically so, the cause of abolitionism. And he understood, academic that he was, that emancipation itself was not enough, but rather to destroy slavery, as he wrote on abolitionism. Slavery in Brazil was much more than a working relationship to sugar plantations, the coffee plantations in the south of the country. It was, in point of fact, a true economic, social, and cultural system that permeated the entire national reality. And if they really want to give rise to a truly democratic country, you're going to have to destroy slavery first, emphasizing that in addition to the democratization and the liberation of slaves, you have to spread out and democratically distribute the land, that over and above the liberation of slaves, that there be a program where slaves would be trained so they could be transformed into true, qualified, free workers and able to incorporate themselves truly into Brazilian society. And many of his speeches having to do with this incorporation into Brazilian society, those slaves that the abolitionist movement tried to free, seems like to have adopted a different tone from many others that participated in the abolitionist movement. So his premonition of the need, the imperative need to incorporate freed slaves into Brazilian society, people that would leave captivity behind and truly be able to live their citizenship. His commitment with monarchic causes, I think it's ably justified in his writings, and often we tend to see or to attempt to oppose the true path of history, because monarchism as a social reformist cause had continued on in Brazil even after, when at first freedom of slaves or emancipation was blocked, monarchic philosophies and his, Nabuco's, grew more mature, and he wrote The Statesman of the Empire, where he weds nostalgia for imperial institutions with what he called the great era of Brazil. He remained very concerned, and this is a circumstance that this is how he described Jacobinism, monarchy, and the Republic, and his commitment grew greater with freedom.
When he convinces himself through that journey to France, and as of that difficult time, when he consolidates and stabilizes, or he sees it stabilize in France, he convinces himself of the importance of unity, of stability that monarchy could render in terms of the Brazilian institutions, and above all, because he identifies within the democracy on the basis of his experience, the monarchy would be a guarantor of liberty. So even at that moment when he participates in the most radical social movement as an abolitionist, we only remember that his colleague, José Mariano, organized the mobilization, who founded the Anteater Club. And Joaquim Nabuco made contact with movements which would support more radical attitudes that would beyond the institutional movement. But he focuses his emphasis as a parliamentarian, such that all of these movements would support the abolitionist movement, and made sure that none of these ran counter to this movement for liberty. And this marked the coherence of his attitude. He eventually recognized, well, through one of his letters, he supported a runaway slave. And even with this institutional emphasis for emancipation, he also made personal contact with radical sectors of the movement, like the Anteater Club and other abolitionists who were more radical, but always with an emphasis on the concept of liberty. And through his attachment to the monarchy, it had to do with unity, the dynasty, and to render possible in Brazil in a unique way a government that was apart from those of the rest of Latin America. When the Republic was proclaimed, he identified it with militarism and Jacobinism that frightened his spirit, his liberal spirit, his vision. His monarchist vision was then one of integration and of a reforming monarchy, of a liberal monarchy, and even in exile or abroad, he would nourish a lot of these hopes. When the Armada was organized, he still then entertained the viability of monarchy, and through a reformist trend that would be perhaps federalist in nature. And in Pernambuco, there were also in local movements for independence. In 1824, the Praeta Revolution, and above all, he visualized a monarchical program that would be at once reformist, that would incorporate the excluded masses and the cause of abolitionism. Therefore, I believe that Joaquim Nabuco had imbued through his works the capacity to suggest some premonitions of the sort, some foresight, which eventually came to be, when he says that the work of the abolitionist didn't end with the integration of ex-slaves. If that didn't happen, that the future of the nation would be compromised. He had a great insight at that point, an enormous premonition, as Brazil, to this day, is one of the countries that suffers the most inequality and difficulties in the sense of incorporating all of its people and ensuring that they partake of citizenship in an equal way. And despite all the invitations that Nabuco received to participate in the Republic and have a prominent position, whether through foreign affairs and the revolt of the Armada, he maintains his ideological coherence, and he deepens his intuition in the sense that this wasn't a good start. It wasn't a good start in the sense that the new Brazilian Republic was born of a military revolt that was Jacobin, and it didn't represent liberty. He notices that, or he indicates that this bad beginning would lead to future problems in terms of the consolidation of the political system of Brazil. This is really a landmark, this in the sense, this indication that that was a bad beginning, and this represents sort of a continuing reality of never-ending military coups and the difficulty in consolidating an authentic democracy for our people. Another foresight that he had, and which really was important in the history of Brazil in the 20th century, is when he reacts to the naval revolt, and through a number of articles that he published in the national newspapers, when he warns that it wouldn't represent a good start for the Floriano Peixoto government to accept the intervention of foreign navies to suppress the revolt in Bahia, in the Bay of Guanabara. And this acceptance of criticism of the intervention of the armadas, that this would represent, or of the naval revolt, this would represent problems for the future. So this foresight emerges from his reflection, from the constancy of his ideals. So I'm a real admirer of Joaquim Nabuco. I'm so happy to participate in events such as this, and I believe that his foresight, his thought, is very pertinent to our day. 100 years later, that there occurred in our country a real consensus surrounding the need to recognize the problem of slavery, that although they were freed by the Aurea Law, they weren't really incorporated into Brazilian society, and programs such as this would surely have the approval of Joaquim Nabuco, this great citizen or son of Pernambuco, and one of the founding fathers of our country.
In concluding our work today, I want to still the Pernambucan bravura that in the attempt to go over the Paulistas, natives of St. Paul and Alagoas, that explains a lot of things here. The Academy would like to highlight amongst such distinguished people and friends as we have here with us today, Domício Coutinho, who has a life where he's represented Brazil in New York with extreme dedication. And also, it's a pleasure to have, for the Academy to have the Consulate Ambassador Barbuda again an old friend of Brazilian culture, always present, always interested in our issues, and the ladies here present today. The ladies always merit a special attention from us. We have here Patricia Hunt. And let me just say to you, ladies and gentlemen, recalling Oscar Wilde, who said that he loved the simple things as long as they were also the best things. I imagined in advance that this was a simple meeting, but it was, in point of fact, looking back on it, one of the best. And we need credit here, Professor Billington, and especially this dear and esteemed friend of the cultural cause of Brazil, that is Mauro Vieira, ambassador, who yet again performed and behaved much as we would expect of him, with dedication, competence, and quality in everything he touches. I don't like things to be, I don't like splits. I like to see things come together. And what we had here today in the voices we heard of all of our speakers, everyone was coming together. No one was splitting in their own directions. And so this message that I would like Professor Jackson to take back with him to Yale, because I am well aware of the fact that Professor Nabuco loved your university, Professor. He was zealous about everything that is done on behalf of humanity, what's said and done at Yale. Nor could I omit to say that every analysis presented here was wise, but the Pernambucan soul was soothed with the warmth that I detected in all of the speakers. All obviously loved Nabuco, and when you love Nabuco, you love Pernambuco. He's our best ambassador, and therefore I am truly grateful for everything I've heard here and for all of the efforts of the Library of Congress, the presence of Brazilian diplomats, the distinguished professors that came and gave us their lessons, and I am especially pleased to have had here today the assurance and support of Ivo Pitangui and Geraldo Cavalcanti. We're all great. I guess we're all very vain here in the Academy, but they are enormous figures within the Academy. And so I simply wanted to thank them and to ask Ambassador Mauro to then conclude our session with his remarks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. I wanted to briefly, after all of the presentations, brilliant presentations, and above all after these final words on the part of the President of the Brazilian Academy, and there's very little to say at this point, very little to add, but I would like merely to thank once again the indispensable participation of the Brazilian Academy and of its president, Marcos Vilaça. Without his enthusiastic support from the beginning, when I remarked that this project still hadn't arrived in Washington at the end of last year, he reminded me immediately of the centenary of Nabuco and remarked that I wouldn't have time to organize it by the date in January because I only arrived in mid-January, but he immediately put himself at our disposal with brilliance, enthusiasm, and extended invitations to participate in the seminar to the other members of the Brazilian Academy who also were represented by Ivo Pitangui and Ambassador Geraldo Orlando Cavalcante. I would like also, through this effort, to recognize the participation of the Library of Congress and Dr. James Billington, without whose help we wouldn't have been able to get together in this beautiful room and in this institution that's so recognized after 2 centuries. We wouldn't have been able to meet here in this room, and it's all thanks to his passion, to his enthusiasm, his passion for Brazil. He has visited our country before, and again, he can count on an invitation on the part of the Brazilian Academy of Letters that he's welcome next year to visit us, and he'll be received as deservedly with open arms by the Brazilian Academy in Rio de Janeiro next year. I would also like to immensely thank Professor Leslie Bethel, who's a great scholar, a Brazilianist researcher, interested in questions not only political and historical but cultural, and who has been a great voice in spreading news about Brazil, Brazilian culture. Thank you very much for your participation. Likewise, Professor David Jackson, whom I had the pleasure of meeting in August of this year at the Brazilian Academy when the literary supplement, special literary supplement, was published in the Jornal do Comércio Pernambuco about Joaquim Nabuco. We were able to speak with great enthusiasm about the organization of this seminar, and he also immediately put himself at our disposal. I want to thank everyone who participated, who helped organize. I want to thank everybody present to lend prestige to this important meeting, and which represents another gesture, however simple, in recognition of the great Brazilian, the great statesman, great abolitionist, a statesman, politician. It's 1 century later, a successor, a modest successor, I would say, in representing Brazil before the American government, the American people. Thank you very much again. Good afternoon.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.